Hi, so I am going to teach you how to make one of these masks. I got the patterns from the COVID Rangers website. That's www.covidrangers.com. So the mask will have an outside patterned fabric, and then the inside lining can be whatever you want. So either solid, something that you don't really care about, or it could also be a pattern if you like. And then for the ties, I use something called bias binding. You can also use fabric ribbon. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna download the patterns off of the COVID Rangers website, and you'll see that you'll have two larger patterns. So these are the patterns for the outside fabric. And then you're gonna have two smaller ones, which will be the inside line. So if you look here on the left-hand side, this is a larger one. So you'll see I cut on the main cut line. That's where I cut it out. And then the lining, which is smaller, will be the lining cut line. That's where you cut then. So what I did, which may be easier for you too, is I have two of each. So these things are essentially the same. And I did that because what you're gonna wanna do is you have to cut one in this direction and one in this direction in order for them to line up like this. It doesn't really make sense, but it will once you start. So what you'll wanna do is you'll wanna pin the pattern to the fabric and cut around it. Alternatively, if you have light colored fabric, you can lay it down and then trace with a Sharpie or a pen or whatever you like, and then cut it that way. And you'll do the same thing for the lining. So because my lining is not dual-sided, it's the same color on both sides, it doesn't matter. So I can just put these in any orientation I like and cut, same thing. Okay, so after you did that, then you'll have 4 pieces of fabric. What you're gonna wanna do is line up your pattern pieces right sides together. So right side means the pretty side. So put both pretty sides together, line them up right on top of each other. Let me make this a little easier. Right on top of each other. And then you're gonna wanna sew around the curved edge here. And I use something called a 1/4 seam allowance. So on your sewing machine, I essentially line it up like this. So the edge of my fabric lines up with this edge of the foot of my sewing machine, and I just sew down. And because you're creating masks that you'll theoretically want to be able to wash, you want to really make sure to reinforce the ends like this. All right, so after you do this, you'll do the exact same thing for the lining, which I did here. And now what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to open your outside fabric to where the pretty side is facing up. And then you'll do the same thing with the lining, where the pretty side is facing down. And remember, the lining in our case is both on the same on both sides. So in this case, you'll want to do it to where the yucky part is sticking up. And it's the same thing for the underneath. So the yucky side is sticking up. So essentially it's right sides together. Now you're gonna wanna pin these together right on top of each other. So I've done this here. So you'll wanna line up, first what I do, it just makes it easier, is you line up the point of the mask and pin on either side of the point and then pin down. And what you're gonna notice is you're gonna have a little bit extra sticking out at the sides. And that's okay, because you're gonna wanna actually fold this over and sew, which you'll see in a little bit. So line them up on the bottom too, like this. And you should see about 1/2 inch sticking out on either side. Now what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna sew these together. So what I'm doing is this is the bottom part of the mask, And I lined the edge of the fabric to the right side of the foot. And you're gonna wanna reinforce that edge again. So essentially what that means, sew a little bit and then click this reverse button, back up, reinforce, and then back up again. And then sew all the way down to this edge and then reinforce again at the very bottom. Then you're gonna turn it around and do the exact same thing on the top part. So now this is what it should look like. And now you're going to turn it inside out by just opening up the side and pulling it through to where it will actually look, and it won't be inside out anymore. So now you're gonna do something called a top stitch. So essentially what the top stitch does, it just keeps it folded without the use of a iron. So what you're gonna do is, it's a little tricky, but you want to sew right here to where it doesn't come apart anymore. It's hard to explain, but you sew. So when you put it in your sewing machine, just be careful to keep it taut, and you'll want to sew like 1/8 of an inch right along that seam. See what that looks like. Just along that seam to where it keeps that nice fold. And now you'll repeat the same thing along the bottom. Now we're gonna work on the straps. So you can use either fabric ribbon, or you can get something called bias binding. So it typically will come in a pack like this. This is obviously a really old one. But you don't want it to be too thick. So I wouldn't go thicker than this. I assume this is a 1/2 inch because you want to be able to tie it. So now what I've done is I've cut them in strips of about 17 inches long. You don't want them to be too short because then you won't be able to tie them, and you don't want them to be too long either because then they'll get in the way. So I found around 17 inches is a good amount. And then what you're gonna wanna do is line it up with the bottom like this, so there's a little bit of an overlap, and pin it there on either side. And then you will, actually don't pin it quite yet. You'll turn it over like that and then pin it in place on either side. And I added one in the middle just to make sure it stayed in place. Now I've lined it up in my sewing machine, and it's around the width of the foot. So I'll just sew right down the center. And that's what it should look like. And see how I reinforce the stitches where it joins. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fold it one more time, pin it in place, and then do the exact same thing again. Sew it right down the center. And there you have it, a tie back mask that is 2 pieces of fabric thick. So I know the COVID Rangers site does elastic, so this is a little bit of a deviation, and there's also more fancy things you can do, but I found that this is the quick and easiest way to make a mask, and it covers your face pretty well. And one thing I forgot to mention before, I chose the medium size because I figured it would be more versatile as opposed to the large or the small. So yeah, good luck.